right, so just a couple housekeeping items first. As I said, thank you so much for being here, for spending your time learning how we can all create a kinder future for animals. This is my favorite topic to talk about, writing for animals, and a lot of the info that you're going to be learning about today, I'll have a few resources that I'll share with you in a folder at the end of the session, so you don't have to capture everything, but do feel free to take screenshots or notes if you find something that really resonates with you. I also just want to offer kind of a general content warning. There are going to be a few examples I'll share that address violence towards animals. And if you need to take a break, need to take off your volume for a minute, take down your volume for a minute, totally understand that. If you need to go to the bathroom, get something to eat, just do what you need to do to be comfortable and have a meaningful session today. And like Teresa said, we'll take most questions at the end, but if you have anything urgent, feel free to drop it in the chat sooner. So I would like to start with a question. What brings you here today? And if you could share your answer in the chat, that would be fantastic. Just let us know in a few words what motivated you to want to be a part of this session, maybe what you hope you learn or what you hope you might get out of this. And we'll just see kind of what is motivating us to be here today. And for Vicky in the chat, I will try to warn you if there is kind of disturbing language coming. There won't be any visuals, but I'll try to give you a warning for that. So we have from some answers coming in here, hoping to write more for animals. From Michelle, hoping to improve my advocacy skills. From Kat, thank you for your responses. Frequently read articles that I feel need to be addressed, but I'm not sure the best way to go about it. Great reason to be here. Doing a sermon on veganism and animal rights next week. That's fantastic. Thank you for sharing these responses. These are all really helpful and help me get a sense of what I can most address as I go through my slides today. Very cool. Thank you so much for sharing, and we can also keep reading those in the chat as we go. But really appreciate you sharing your motivations. And I have one more question for you before we move on into the main session, which is a poll that I think Teresa is going to launch right now, if that's possible, Teresa. And the poll is just, how much writing experience do you have? To get a sense of who's in the room today. Are you someone with a lot of writing experience? Maybe you're newer to writing, and maybe you're somewhere in between. So you should see the poll popping up on your screen now, and you can just indicate your answer. And we can actually see that, I think, updating live for most of us. But in about 5 seconds, we'll close out the poll and see our results. 3, 2, 1. And Teresa, if you want to end that poll and then show us the results. Awesome. So we have quite an experienced group here, it looks like. And then we also have a few folks with less experience or just a little bit of experience, but it's nice to see we're kind of all over the map. And I think whether you have a lot of experience or you're newer to writing, I hope you'll find some of the tips and tricks here useful today. So I am going to move to my next slide and just share that my goal for our session today is to help you tell stories that make a difference for animals. My hope is that you will get some valuable new tools in your toolkit so that you can inspire the people you write for to take action. A little bit more about me. As I mentioned, my name is Julie Knopp. I've been writing op-eds and placing stories in the news for about a decade. It all started for me. I was living in northern Mexico, and at the time, there was this kind of community of salespeople who sold clothes, shoes, books, all sorts of things in this little market around the town square. And it was a really inviting group. And I thought, geez, I would love to get to know those folks better, be a part of that community. It just seemed really close-knit and connected. And I had been in a clown ministry in high school. And so I thought, maybe I can sell my balloon animals. Maybe that's something I could bring to the table. So I started selling balloon animals. And to be honest, it was kind of a bust. There were a lot of kids who were interested, but a lot of parents who would kind of say, I don't know, we need to spend any money on balloon animals. So I tried to think of something that everyone would be interested in getting. And I came up with jokes. And so for 5 pesos each, I would tell a joke to the buyer. And at one point, a reporter came and did a news story on the joke sales. And what really blew my mind was how after that story was shared, there was just a flood of people coming in to get jokes, right? And there was also people coming in to connect about Minnesota or any number of other things they had seen in the article. And it struck me because even in this very digital, very modern era, there's still so much reach in conventional news. And there's still such promise in getting people to act off of things that they see and are inspired by in conventional news. So that got me interested in doing more media strategy work and doing more writing to promote some of the nonprofit causes I was involved with. And today I hope to kind of share everything I've learned over that past decade of writing with you. So the top 3 things that I hope you walk away with today: 1, just the knowledge of the impact that a good story can have. Secondly, more tools and tips and tricks to write effectively and to write in a way that sparks change. And then lastly, if you're interested, kind of the nuts and bolts of how do you publish an op-ed or a personal essay in the news. So let's dig in, and we'll start with kind of why your writing matters and what is the potential of a great story. I love to visit this study as an example. This is a 2018 study from the Washington Post. About 3,500 participants read op-eds representing different points of view, or they read no op-ed at all. And then they completed a survey about their opinion on the issue. And the participants became significantly more likely to agree with the perspective of the author whose op-ed they had read. And those results remained stable when they revisited the participants and their opinions a month later. And there was a similar effect found between policymakers and the general public. And I think this is just huge, that just one well-written op-ed can have such a remarkable impact and a lasting impact on readers' opinions. And this quote really kind of summarizes the study well, I think. That suggests each well-written op-ed changes a lot of minds. If a successful op-ed is read by about 500,000 people, we can expect it changes between 50,000 and 100,000 minds. And that's just wild to me, the impact that one powerful story can have. And I think we can kind of extrapolate this also to other forms of media, right? We can see that an effective, well-written social media post can reach millions. And if it's reaching millions, that it can also really change hearts and minds in powerful and lasting ways. So I may be biased, but I do believe that a good piece of writing can change your community and change the world. I also want to talk a little bit about developing your concept. I think some of you here may already have an idea of what you like to write about or what you want to focus on in your next writing. And some may not be as sure of where to start. And I like to use as kind of a broad starting point the words of theologian Frederick Buechner. He describes purpose as where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. I think this is a great starting point for writing too. So in my case, I love animals. They bring me a lot of joy. And I also know that most animals are exploited for food and lead very difficult, short lives. So that's kind of where I find my intersection, that I want to write about how we can improve the lives of animals in our food system. And I'm curious, for you, as you think about what's that intersection, where does your knowledge, your experience, and your passion kind of intersect in a way that you can find a sweet spot for what you're excited about writing about? And I have a couple particular tips as well. Once you kind of get that general idea established, there are a couple ways that you might kind of start to narrow in on a particular area of focus for a piece. One, and I swear by this one, is Google Alerts. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with Google Alerts. Teresa's going to put a link into the chat on how to set those up. But essentially, you can choose a word, a phrase, an issue that you care about, that you want to focus on. And you just plug that in. It takes less than 5 minutes to set this up. And Google will package up the biggest kind of online stories, news stories that came out during a given day or week or month. You can set the time frame of how frequently you want to receive these alerts. And we'll send them to you. So for example, I really like writing about birds, both wild and farmed. And so I have a Google alert set up for birds where Google will package for me some of the top stories that came out about birds each week and send them to me in an email on Sundays. And that way on Sunday, instead of kind of trying to parse through all the overwhelming number of news sources that exist, I can kind of get a more neatly packaged consolidated way to go through some of the biggest stories about birds on a given week. So once you've narrowed down your area of focus, highly recommend setting up Google Alerts on your issue. And then also, as you may already be doing, just to be following news sources and whether it's on social media or different organizations, be linked in with groups that are doing work in the area you care about. And the reason that I think this is so key, and I'll talk more about this later, is that if you're looking to place your story in the news or get attention on a piece of writing, the timeliness factor is super crucial to getting attention and interest. And so if you have your finger on the pulse of what's happening related to the issue you care about, I think you're going to be more effective in getting attention and coverage for that issue. So a few tips for how to spark change with your writing. One of my favorite books is called Made to Stick: Why Some Ideas Survive and Others Die by Chip and Dan Heath. And this book essentially studies ideas that have been especially popular or effective in recent decades and identifies what those sticky ideas have in common, whether it's a campaign, an advertising campaign, or a new program at a nonprofit. And what I find with the 6 elements that they found that relate to sticky ideas, that sticky ideas share in common, that those elements are also true for what I call sticky writing that's particularly memorable, particularly effective, also shares those same 6 core elements. So I'm going to share with you what those 6 core elements are. And in the book, they are kind of under the umbrella of this acronym that they call success. So the first S in the success is simple. So we're really looking to write in a way that is brief, write in a way that is clear. The second part of the acronym is the U, and that's for unexpected. So using an element of surprise in our writing, really trying to surprise our readers. The third piece is concrete, writing in a way that is accessible and easy to understand. The fourth piece is credible. So using as many sources, credible sources as we can, linking claims in our writing, pointing to resources or sources of information in our writing to establish that what we're sharing is true. Next, the E stands for emotional. Our writing is most effective when we're pulling on the heartstrings and utilizing an element of emotion. And lastly, that S is stories, which is maybe the most key piece of making sure to use storytelling to convey messages and arguments in our writing. And I want to share an example of a lead in an article that I wrote that I think checks kind of most of the boxes of these 6 elements. So you can just get a sense of what this looks like in practice. And this is one of those examples that may be hard to hear. And so if you'd rather not hear it, it should only take about 30 seconds to a minute at most, so you can just turn off your volume or step away. But this is from an article I wrote a couple years ago, and I'll start reading now. Earlier this summer, 200,000 hens died in a massive fire at Forsman Farms, an egg farm in Wright County. The birds trapped inside the barn suffered excruciating deaths, their flesh melting away as they frantically searched for a way out of their cages. According to a spokesperson for Forsman Farms, no one was injured in the fire. Now, so if we go back to the success acronym, we see that that was a simple and brief introduction. It had an element of surprise in that most of us wouldn't expect the spokesperson to respond in that way. It was concrete, easy to wrap our heads around. It was credible in that in the article, I was able to link to sources that was said and that tragic incident did happen. it was emotional, and that most of us that have some degree of empathy probably feel some difficult emotions imagining that amount of suffering. And it was a story, right? So even in a small amount of writing, like a short intro paragraph, we can fit in most, if not all, of these success elements to really make our writing sticky. I'm going to go into some more do's and don'ts for your writing. These apply to most kinds of writing. Most of the do's and don'ts you'll hear apply to any kind of writing. But all of them are especially relevant to writing op-eds or personal essays or articles that you would want to place in the news. So the first one is to read what you want to write. Sounds pretty simple, but it really is so essential. If your goal is to place an op-ed in your local newspaper, I highly recommend that you be reading the op-eds in your local newspaper. If you want to be placing a personal essay in HuffPost or the New York Times, that you would be reading personal essays in HuffPost and New York Times to get a sense of what the editors are selecting and what's really working in those pieces so that you can get inspiration and emulate that in your own writing. I mentioned this before, but I really can't overstate the importance of weaving in current news or other timely information early on in your writing. This has really been a big learning curve for me because as someone passionate about animal advocacy, I figured, hey, if I write a great piece about factory farming, someone's going to want to publish that. And it's been hard to accept that that's actually typically not true. Unless it is in the news now and I can find a way to weave that news in and prove that this issue is timely. And that's, again, where your Google alerts or just your eye on the news is going to be helpful to you. What I like to do is actually to write a little bit about the issue I'm focusing on. So, for example, factory farming, and then be watching the news. And when that news comes out, when there's a story about factory farming in mainstream news, take that, use what I've already written, and just weave in that timely piece. And so now I really quickly was able to put together something that I can submit to an editor. And I'll probably be one of the first ones to submit that because I already had most of my writing ready to go, but I was just able to adjust it to be a little bit more positioned in terms of this recent news story. So highly, highly recommend that you focus on finding something timely to position your writing within. One of my biggest areas of focus anytime that I teach is about simplicity. And you heard me mention it with the success acronym as well. But this is also a challenge for many writers, including me, because I think we feel like we have something important to talk about. And so parsing that down and getting just to the simplest form of it can be really challenging. And I want to share a couple of resources related to this. First, this is from the book, Writing for Busy Readers. Highly recommend that book as well. So many of us are busy, we're overwhelmed with media, and this book is all about the most recent research. It came out last year, the most recent research related to how to get busy people to act upon what they're reading. And so this example was part of their study. Harvard researchers, they sent email A, that you can see on the left, to a large pool of people. It's a campaign email intended to raise funds. Then they sent email B out to a different group. They randomly removed half the paragraph. So if you actually read email B, it does not really make sense. But email B raised more money. And it's really mind-blowing. I think about this almost every time that I write, because it may seem like you need to articulate every important point related to your issue. But the reality is, with how busy people are, it's often more helpful to be concise. And I think what's happening psychologically here, from what I gather, is that people reading email A, people who open email A, are feeling overwhelmed by the quantity of information they need to go through. Because there's a lot of information, they're not sure exactly what they're being asked to do. But when they're looking at email B, it's short enough where they see right away in that blue text, oh, just click to make a donation. That's what this is all about. So I hope this is helpful to you in remembering that less is more. I just think that is such a valuable thing we can remember as writers. And if you're not sure where to get started with writing more simply, I highly recommend the Hemingway editor. Teresa's going to put a link to this in the chat. It's just a website where you can paste in your writing and get immediate feedback on how you can make your writing more simple. So in this case, I pasted in a paragraph that I wrote, and you can see the Hemingway editor is telling me here that 2 of 5 sentences were very hard to read. 1 of 5 sentences is hard to read. So it's kind of helping me know where to focus with the color coding, and so that I can simplify my writing. It's also important to note that it shows here this writing is at a grade 15 level. Most readers in the US are reading at a 6th to 8th grade reading level. So if you are writing at a high school or a college level, you're really missing out on a bigger audience that you could have. And when you are able to simplify your writing, you're really making it more accessible to a broader audience. So I encourage you to try out the Hemingway editor. You can also try if you want other forms of kind of AI, but getting feedback on how to simplify your writing, I think, is going to make you more effective at compelling people to action. I also want to emphasize using personal experience. I think for some of us, this can be a little uncomfortable. We don't necessarily want to get too much attention or be center stage. But there is a lot of opportunity here. So, for example, I think AI could write a more concise, a more clear and comprehensive article about a topic than many of us here. But what AI doesn't have is real human experience, authentic first-person stories to share that are emotional and true. I think this is where we really have an edge on AI as writers. And I also think, most of us, we're not professional journalists, but we're competing maybe for space or online space for our writing. And so one way that we can really prove our value is by offering original first-person experiences that are unique to us, that a journalist might not have. So really explore that, share personal experience whenever you can. And I think you'll find that that's really attractive to both the general public, if you're sharing on social media or something like that, but also to editors who are looking for those real, genuine human experiences. And just one quote on this that I think about a lot from Pope Paul VI. Modern man listens more willingly to witnesses than to teachers. And if he does listen to teachers, it is because they are witnesses. I'll just read that one more time. Modern man listens more willingly to witnesses than to teachers. And if he does listen to teachers, it is because they are witnesses. So I think as people who are passionate about social change, if we want to impart a lesson, if we want to be teachers about something related to a cause, I think we'll find ourselves more effective when we're sharing our experiences and our truths in our writing. As much as that can be challenging and vulnerable, it seems to be one of the most effective ways to inspire and to teach about these issues. I also encourage you to leverage your credentials, especially if you're sharing articles with news sources. Be sure to mention your connection to animal issues, for example. And that doesn't need to be anything flashy. That could be as simple as saying you're involved with UU Animal Ministries. It could be as simple as saying you're a volunteer at an animal rescue or an animal sanctuary. But when you offer those credentials, you let editors or the public know that you have some credibility, that you have some proximity to the cause that gives you a special reason to be talking about this and a special vantage point into the issue. This is my very favorite piece of writing advice. Think like a lawyer. I got this advice in college, and I think about it almost every time I write, and I hope it'll be useful to you too. The idea is that when you're writing any piece of writing, you have a main point. And every paragraph within your piece of writing should be a piece of evidence proving your main point to be true. And when you're writing any paragraph within your piece, you have your topic sentence or your main idea, and every sentence that follows should be a piece of evidence proving that topic sentence to be true. This is just a really powerful way of building credibility for your claims. And I'll just show this to you in a different way. This is kind of just my anatomy of how to write a great paragraph. Many people have similar breakdowns of how to do it, but I think you can really get a sense of how to think like a lawyer when you look at this kind of setup. You have your topic sentence, which is that main idea, and then your supporting fact one, that first piece of evidence for why your topic sentence is true. Then you have your second piece of supporting evidence, your third, maybe you have a concluding sentence as well. So one example from something I had written. First sentence, topic sentence. Research shows that chickens are social beings with thoughts and feelings. So I've made my claim. Now I need to provide some evidence. My first supporting fact. They can recognize and remember up to 100 faces. Second fact. Chickens also show self-control, resisting smaller food rewards in anticipation of bigger rewards. Third supporting fact. When living in family units, chickens even pass down knowledge from generation to generation. So you can see how I've made my claim, and then everything underneath my claim is a piece of evidence supporting that my main claim is true. Next, do. Consider including a call to action. So one of the first op-eds I published here in Minneapolis in the Minneapolis paper was about food waste. I'd gone dumpster diving, seen incredible food waste, and wanted to tie that to this larger issue of waste in our society. And I had several people reach out and say, I really enjoyed your piece, but what do I do now? And it was a really helpful teaching moment for me that when you stoke up emotion, when you tell a powerful story, people have energy to act. And if you're not providing an opportunity or a sense of direction of how to do that, you might lose out on that energy that's been created. So if you have a call to action, do consider weaving that in after you've done your storytelling, you've kind of shared your evidence about why this is an important issue. Because I think you have a real opportunity to motivate people to action with your writing. And if there's nothing provided, I think often that opportunity is missed. Keep your audience front of mind. For me, as somebody who writes about a lot of farmed animal issues, it's important to remember that most people in the audience that I'm speaking with in the general public do eat animals. And so it's important to write in a way that is accessible and inviting for everyone, right? So I try to put myself in my audience's shoes and try to really imagine what it would feel like to read this piece if I knew nothing about the issue. And try to imagine where might there be gaps, right? Where am I making assumptions about what my audience knows? Maybe I'm assuming that everyone knows that there are often, a lot of animal abuses and mistreatment within factory farms. I might need to actually kind of delineate that a little bit, kind of similar to the example that I was just sharing about chickens. I can't really assume everyone believes or knows that animals think and feel. I really need to prove that in my writing because there's still some people who aren't really on board with that concept. So providing evidence that backs up your claims and fills in the gaps for people who are less familiar with your topic is really valuable. Spotlight the why. I think for many of us, when we're passionate about something, the why seems obvious. But for many of your readers, the why is not obvious, because if it were, we probably wouldn't have this issue anymore, right? We wouldn't have as much animal abuse if everyone was already aware of how critical and troubling it can be and the sentient nature of animals. So make sure that early on in your writing, you are really illustrating and clarifying what's at stake and why this is important for your readers. Do make sure to, if you're writing for mainstream news, adapt your piece to corresponding guidelines from different publishers. So let's say you're submitting your writing to a local newspaper, read their guidelines if they're available for op-eds and make sure that you're following them, right? So that you're within the word limit that they provide. Maybe they also suggest that you paste your op-ed into the body of the email instead of attaching it. There's all kind of little details that different editors will want done differently. So to maximize your chances of getting published, do make sure to read through and apply those guidelines because you're going to be more likely to be successful if you're adapting your piece to the different editors and publications that you're sending your work to. I also suggest developing a short and compelling headline. A lot of people skim these days and they don't get the word for word of everything you're writing. And so your headings and your title, most of all, is what will be seen by more people than anything else. So having a headline that is clear and compelling is going to go a long way. I also use my headline as my subject line when I submit articles to news sources. So for that reason, I also really want it to capture the attention of the editor. There are some really great headline analyzer tools out there. So if you're looking for a good heading, you can plug your headline into this headline analyzer tool. Teresa will drop a link in the chat to this as well. So I was just playing around with one, What You Think You Know About Vegans is Wrong, kind of an inflammatory title. I did not use it, but I wanted to get feedback on it and see kind of how I could play around with that. So you can see that it provides a score for readability, for SEO or search engine optimization, and for sentiment. We won't go into search engine optimization much in this session, but I'll share with you a link to my ebook if you're interested later, and that talks a little bit more about SEO. But it gives me something to work with. I see that, for example, my sentiment score is low, so that means maybe I could plug in some more emotion words, stoke up a little more emotion in my title. So it can just be helpful to use one of these tools as you're playing around with what your title will be, since that may be the most kind of important line that you write as far as the number of people you reach with it. I also really encourage people to be vulnerable in their writing. I think that's another piece that we have kind of an edge on AI with. We can really connect as human beings by being open about things that can be difficult. I just want to share an example from here in Minneapolis. There's an area of Minneapolis, North Minneapolis, that has a higher level of violence than the rest of the city. And one writer, Marcus Hunter II, wrote an article, and it was called, I Live in a Cemetery Called North Minneapolis. And this is the lead into the piece. He writes, every block has trees decorated with names, pictures, and balloons to honor lives lost. I'm afraid I will one day have my own tree. And that vulnerability is just such an opportunity for connection and emotion. And you can imagine, if you were Marcus, like how difficult or uncomfortable it could be to really share that fear with everyone in the public, but how in doing so, you really do create a line of human connection. So I encourage you, when you have the opportunity, to be open and be vulnerable in your writing. And also to engage the senses, sight, sound, smell, taste, touch. Sometimes when we're writing in a persuasive way, there's not as much space for this kind of creative writing, but even a little bit can go a long way. And I want to offer an example for that too. This is another one that may be difficult to hear. So again, feel free to turn down your volume or step away for a moment if you'd like to. I'll start reading now. The scent of rotting flesh filled the air at the Apex Arena in Wytheville, Virginia. Truck after truck pulled up to the arena, unloading more than 600 lifeless coyotes and foxes. Children played amidst the sea of bloodied animal carcasses covering the dirt floor. This scene, witnessed by investigators at the Eastern U.S. Predator Calling Championship in 2022, is the result of a wildlife killing contest. Many such contests take place each year across the U.S. and beyond, and so on. I won't continue reading, but you can see how just a couple sentences there in the intro really can go a long way to pull in scent, to pull in sight, and just give a little bit of an illustration that feels a little more vivid, a little more personal than simply just starting with, something as direct as, wildlife killing contests take place every year in the US, but really adding a little element of vividness of visual to the issue first. A few don'ts for you. Don't assume your audience knows anything about the topic. I think I spoke to this briefly a little bit ago, but I think it's really valuable if you can have your work you're writing read by someone who isn't familiar with the issue that you're writing about. Share it with a friend before you share it with the world or with an editor, and see what that friend who's less familiar with the issue is missing, or what doesn't make sense to them, or where they think you could kind of fill in the gaps. I think there's a lot of improvements we can make to our writing by stepping back and kind of, again, trying to imagine what it would be like to read this piece if you had no familiarity with the issue. Avoid blaming or shaming your readers. From my experience submitting op-eds and personal essays to the news, this simply doesn't get published. I'm sure there are exceptions, but I also edit work for a number of other writers who are advocating for animals or other social justice issues, and I have yet to see a blaming or shaming piece get published in mainstream news. So if you want to have that level of reach and that impact, I really suggest calling people in rather than calling them out, being a welcoming source to your readers. And I also think you will have more success in getting people to act when they feel called in, when they feel welcomed by you, rather than when they feel ashamed of their role in an issue. Be sure not to take rejection personally. I get rejected all the time, and I really see each one as just getting a step closer to a publication. Some writers like to challenge themselves to 100 rejections a year. I tried that a couple years ago. I didn't quite get there, but I did get quite a few. And I think it really is a feather in your cap every rejection you get, because you are building your kind of strength of character as you get closer to a publication. So really keep weathering rejections and don't let them hold you back from further writing. And as I mentioned before, be sure not to exceed word limits or to violate the guidelines of any of the news sources if you're submitting for op-eds or personal essays. So that was a lot of information that I just threw at you. This is just a kind of a consolidated list here of the do's and don'ts I shared. And I'd encourage you, if you're up for it, drop in the chat a do or a don't you heard that you would like to try with your writing. Maybe just one that you could commit to trying out in the coming weeks or months as you write, that maybe will help you strengthen your writing practice or write in a more effective way. And I'll just give you a minute to drop one of those do's or don'ts that stuck with you into the chat. Engage the senses, yeah. Think like a lawyer. Include personal experience. Keep it simple, Betsy says. Google alerts from Robert. Consider including a call to action. Andrea says develop a short, compelling headline. No shaming, Michelle mentions. Engage the senses, Rebecca says. Try the Hemingway editor, highly recommended, Wendy says. Thank you for those, and feel free to keep dropping those into the chat. Yeah, I hope you all were able to find at least one thing that you can kind of claim and aim for in your writing in the coming weeks and months, and hopefully make you more effective at reaching people and kind of changing hearts and minds. So a few opinion writing essentials that I will share now. First, we could have talked about this earlier, but what is an op-ed, right? I'm curious if anyone would like to take a guess in the chat of the year in which the modern op-ed page debuted. Kind of challenging question, but wish I had a prize here. That would be really challenging. It'd be amazing if anybody got it right. 1919, Alex says, great guess. 1901, says Vicky. 1860, says Suzanne. A lot of good guesses. So it was in 1970 that the New York Times debuted the modern opposite the editorial page. And the editor at the time introduced this as sort of designed to be a kind of intellectual arena where political insiders and regular readers could engage with new ideas and discuss public policy. And I want to share with you one New York Times columnist, Thomas Friedman, who shared, this is just a short video, who shares about kind of what makes a great op-ed. And just let me know if you're not hearing it. Hopefully the audio comes through clearly.
What I do, opinion writing, is meant to provoke. It's meant to produce a reaction. And that's why I always tell people, I'm either in the heating business or the lighting business. That's what I do. I'm either doing a heating or a lighting. I'm either stoking up an emotion in you or I'm illuminating something for you. And if I do it right, I will produce one of any number of reactions. You might read my column and say, I didn't know that. That's a good reaction. I produced some light. I never looked at it that way. More light, that's good. I never connected those things. More light, that's good. Your favorite, you live for this as a columnist, happens 4 times a year if you're lucky. You said exactly what I felt, Mr. Friedman, but I didn't know how to say. God bless you. I want to kill you dead, you and all your offspring. I get that. That tells me I produced some heat. Anyways, I explained to you that to produce heat and light required a chemical reaction, and you had to combine 3 chemicals. The first is, what is your value set? What are the principles and ideals you're trying to push into the world as a columnist? Are you a communist, a capitalist, a neocon, a neoliberal, a libertarian, a Keynesian, a Marxist? What are the ideas and principles you're pushing that are the foundation of your opinions? Second, how do you think the machine works? So the machine is my shorthand for what are the biggest forces shaping more things in more places, in more ways, and more days. As a columnist, I'm always carrying around in my head a working hypothesis about how the biggest gears and pulleys of the world work. Why? Because I'm trying to take my values and push the machine in their direction. And if I don't know how it works, I either won't push it or I'll push it in the wrong direction. So I'm always thinking about what are the big gears and pulleys of the world. And lastly, what have you learned about people and culture? Because there's no column without people, and there are no people without culture. How does the machine affect different people and culture? And how do they come back and affect the machine? Stir those three together, let it rise, bake for 45 minutes. And if you do it right, you will produce a column for the New York Times that creates heat or light. What I do, opinion.
Just a second as I get on to the next slide here. I really appreciate that message, because I think the heat or light comparison is just really useful to me. And I think most great op-eds that I have read offer that. And so I think, can you see my screen still, by the way? Okay, excellent. I kind of expanded on what Thomas Friedman was sharing in my writing, just for my own mental process, to this framework for stories. So thinking about that heat and light element, I try to use that up front, right? I detail an emotional story of an individual impacted by the issue as the start of almost every story that I write. Now that can be you, which I think is often even more effective, a story about you or in your first person voice, or it can be the story of someone else, such as an animal. Then I kind of take a step back, explain the broader context of the issue, doing that kind of think like a lawyer, offering my main points, supporting them with evidence. And then I offer a call to action, some sort of invitation for how to positively impact this issue. What can the reader or a leader who's reading this do differently? And then I conclude, and I often conclude by circling back in some way to that initial story that I told. So just for example, a couple years ago here in the Twin Cities, we had a proposed fur ban, a ban on the sale of new furs, animal furs. So I knew someone who had a dog who had been caught in a fur trap and had lost a leg, been rescued, and then made their way to this friend of mine. So I told the story of the rescue of their dog. Then I backed up and explained some of the ethical and environmental issues around the production of furs from animals. Then I encouraged readers to contact their representative in support of this bill. And then I closed out by circling back to where that dog is today and the loving home and the loving life they have and how we can kind of aspire to that for all animals. So that's just one example of how you might frame stories in a way that utilizes heat and light, gets kind of that emotion stoked up, but then also provides that real kind of more evidence-based, high-level thinking for readers. So a few more things about the actual publication process for op-eds and personal essays. This is the process I use. I start by developing my concept, right? So I'm looking for stories in the news. I'm looking for a news hook. I'm building around that and making my argument around an issue that matters to me. Then I'm drafting my piece, and we'll share at the end a template that I've used in the past for writing out stories or op-eds. It's pretty highly structured. It might be more useful for people who are newer to writing. If you're more experienced with writing, I think you maybe can just go out on your own and draft your piece in the way that feels natural to you. Once you've established your outline and you put your piece together with more detail, I think the biggest part of the process for me is the revision piece. This is really where I spend most of my time. Not only am I rereading my piece, I'm rereading it, thinking about it as if I'm an outsider, trying to figure out where those gaps are, where I'm making assumptions, how it would feel if I was reading it as someone who had no connection to the issue. I'm also reading it aloud. I highly encourage reading your writing aloud at least once in your process because it gives you a really fresh vantage point on that writing. And I highly encourage having other people read your writing. So that might be somebody who is great at writing. That might be somebody who is familiar with the issue you're writing about, or it might be somebody who's totally unfamiliar with the issue you write about. Ideally, it would be all three. I usually like to have at least 2 or 3 people read through my piece before I'm sending it to editors. But you can see what you have capacity and time for. But revision is really the biggest part of my process. And then, of course, pitching your piece. And that's the last thing I'll be talking about here is what does that pitching process look like if you're interested in getting your stories into the news? Question, we'll launch a poll again. Teresa's going to launch this poll momentarily. Have you ever pitched an op-ed before? Have you ever sent in a story you wrote to the news to see if they would publish it? And you can just, it'll be a yes or no question, and you can just indicate your answer once you see that poll go up. And then Teresa will close out that poll in about 5 seconds, so make sure to get your answers submitted. And then in 3, 2, 1, Teresa, you can end that poll and share those results. So we have a good mix here, but most people have not submitted an op-ed, and then a few people have. Great, good to have a rounded out group. So I recommend if you're interested in trying out pitching a story, and if there's ever a time, it's now, it's a very, very challenging social and political climate. If you've ever wondered about if you should publish something in the news, I think now is a great time to consider it. And like I said, I think you might be surprised by the number of hearts and minds you can impact that way. So getting started, you've gone through the process of writing your op-ed or your personal essay. I often conflate those two just because those two areas tend to be the ones that are most accessible to those who are not professional journalists. So some news sources will call them op-eds, and those might be third person or first person pieces. Personal essays, of course, are always going to be first person, but either way, those are areas of the news that tend to be populated more by people who don't have professional journalistic experience. And it's more accessible for those of us who maybe don't have those credentials. So I like to start with a couple of reach publications, so places where I would just be really jazzed to get my writing published there that may be a high level of visibility. I'll share via email or however the submission process is recommended to go to those 2 places, 2 or 3 places. Then if I don't hear back in a few days, I will submit to some more like good fit publications. So here in Minnesota, we have a couple of online newspapers that have a pretty good statewide reach. So I might aim for a couple of those. If I don't hear back in a few days, maybe I would share it on social media via email with friends, or maybe I'd look at some community newspapers that we have in the Twin Cities. But I think that can be kind of a nice process to go through so that you can aim high, but then also if that doesn't work out, have some other options that you can still approach along the way. What should your pitch look like?
We did get a question you somewhat answered, but just wanting to know more about the difference between a letter to the editor and an op-ed piece.
Yeah, great question. Thank you for asking that. Your letters to the editor are typically going to be significantly shorter. So an average letter to the editor might be about like 150 to 250 words, whereas an op-ed is probably going to be 600 to 800 words. So you're getting a little bit more in-depth with an op-ed or a personal essay, whereas with a letter to the editor, you're often just really briefly addressing an issue. That can be really powerful too, especially because you can use a lot of the same tips that you've heard today, but you'll have probably a higher likelihood of getting your letter to the editor published because you're asking for less real estate in the newspaper, right? There's a lot of competition for space in print publications, especially. And so if you are competing for that space, you may have a higher rate of acceptance when your writing is shorter. So definitely encourage you to try that as well. Also less time consuming, but then of course the advantage with the op-ed is that you're getting more eyes because you're taking up more real estate. So there's pros and cons each way. But thank you for that question. That's
also someone asked you pitch all 3 at the same time. You talked a little bit about that, but you had the 3 different, the safety.
Yeah, that's also a fantastic question. You're going to hear different opinions depending on who you ask. When I was a writing fellow with Sentient Media, which is an online news source that's dedicated to animal issues, highly recommend checking them out. their editor at the time would recommend to send them all out at the same time. Anybody you might want to possibly publish your piece, maybe it's 10, maybe it's 20, however many, send them all out. For me, that feels a little bit stressful, just because then you may have multiple people responding saying that they're both planning to publish it. It kind of puts you in this awkward social position. So that's why I prefer to reduce that simultaneousness and just do a couple at a time. And what I would also recommend is when you hear back, just to right away at that point to let any other outstanding requests to clarify with those people that you've had your piece picked up by a different publisher. Because some of the editors I've worked with will publish pieces without notifying you. And so you could end up in a real quandary if your piece got published by two publishers. So if you do have your piece published or someone notifies you that it's going to be published, make sure to let any other outstanding emails close out by saying, this has already been picked up. But just because a lot of like what I'm recommending and what the experts recommend is the timeliness of pieces in order to get published. For that reason, it is hard to go one at a time. So I do recommend you probably want to have a few out there at the same time, going, like I'm saying, two to three, maybe more if you feel bold. But because there's some time sensitivity, it's hard to go one by one and be waiting a few days after each email, because then it becomes less time relevant. So, everyone has to make up their own decision about how they want that process to look, but that's my general suggestion. So how would your pitch look? You would have a greeting, a statement that you're submitting an op-ed, an explanation of why that topic is important, any credentials that you have to offer, and then a closing. It's pretty simple. And I'll give an example. This is a little more complicated than it might need to be, but just to show you a real example of a pitch I sent that did end up in publication. Dear editor, I hope you're having a nice holiday season. I know this can be a busy time of year, so thank you for taking the time to read my email. It's nice to have a line or two of just like rapport building, connection, and appreciation, if you can have that at the start. I'm a freelance writer covering topics related to animals and the environment. You could also say, I'm an animal advocate, writing about animal issues in my community, something like that. My work has been published in XYZ. If you haven't had your work published, no need to include that. You can explore more work samples on my website. Again, you don't need that part either, but if you have an example of previous work, feel free to link to it. Please consider publishing the op-ed attached and below. I often like to attach a Word doc and also paste the op-ed below my email because different editors have different preferences around that. It explores the profound implications of a groundbreaking animal protection case that will go before New York State's highest court in 2022. So that was my line kind of explaining why this is relevant now. And then I offered a credential at the time as president of Compassionate Action for Animals in Minneapolis. I'm uniquely positioned to offer insight on this topic. Happy to collaborate on revisions. Thank you for your time and consideration. I also want to share that the first time I published an op-ed, my email was, dear editor, please consider the attached piece for publication. That was all, and it was published. So you really don't need anything this detailed. It may be a little bit of a support in getting attention, but you can also just write a great piece and just let it speak for itself. Just have that simple line of please consider the attached piece for publication and leave it at that. I think you can have success with that as well. So you don't need all of this. It's just an example. So that's kind of the pitching process in a nutshell. And I could talk about this for hours, but I also want to leave time for questions and some time for us to discuss. So if you're interested right now, you feel energized, you feel interested in writing for animals and want to, if you're specifically interested in publishing something in the news, do feel free to write up a draft and send it my way free of charge. I'm happy to review your work, give you some feedback, give you some edits. I really appreciate you being here and learning with me, and I would be happy to support you in your animal advocacy. So consider that kind of an option for homework if you're looking for something more. And I also just wanted to share, if you're looking for another piece of homework, I have recently published an ebook called Effective Storytelling for Social Change. And if you took this class, you can use this discount code Writing for Animals to get 40% off today. You can go to, Teresa will put this link in the chat, but it's writewithjulie.etsy.com. You can get it with that discount code, it's just a couple bucks. And it just has absolutely everything that I've learned packaged into clear and practical ebook for you to make a difference for animals with your writing. So definitely consider that. I do a happy dance every time I make a sale, so it would just make my day to see a sale come through. And because you've been here, I also want to offer you some of that content free of charge. And so Teresa's going to drop a link in the chat to some resources. I have a template for op-eds. I have a guide to ethical storytelling, and I've got a couple of other things in there that you can explore and learn from. And I have a consolidated list of those do's and don'ts that I shared also in that resources folder. So you can just download those at your leisure. And if you want to stay in touch, as I said, feel free to reach out if you want me to review any of your work. My email is right here on the screen, julieknopp@gmail.com. And I also have an e-newsletter that I send out every 2 to 3 months with some kind of animal advocacy and writing related content, as well as some personal content. And you can sign up for that at julieknopp.com. It's just the big button at the top of the screen where you'll land. So thanks again for being here. I'd love to open it up to some questions and hear from you about your experiences with writing. So I am gonna close out of my screen share, and I don't know, Teresa, if we had any other questions come in the chat, but otherwise maybe, Teresa, do you want people to raise their hands or should they just drop things into the chat? What would work best?
Well, let's see how it goes with just people raising their hands. I think that would be great. And thank you, Julie. That was so excellent. My second time through it, and I still learned more things, some really good practical tips. I hope it gets me going on doing more of that. So thank you. And thanks for the questions we've already had and all the participation. So just raise your hand, either physically, turn on your camera, raise your hand, or use the little raise the hand icon, and I can call on you. And we have some time here to take some more questions. And just be sure to check out the chat for all the things that Julie was talking about, the resources. Suzanne, I think you're the first one I'm seeing.
Thank you. And thank you so much for doing this, and Julie for your presentation. So I have with me, this was in today's New York Times. I haven't even read the article yet. Like bingo, but with beef. Meat raffles offer a chance to stock your freezer and help youth sports. So they're using this as a fundraiser with children. I feel like I want to write something, and I thought, where do I even start? And this is just one. I have many articles that I come across. That may be too big a question.
It's a great question, and I appreciate your passion for it. I think, that actually, to the question that came up earlier about letters to the editor, I think often when you read an article that gives you a really strong response where you really want to act on it, letters to the editor are a great way to take action, because you're not writing a whole, new piece. You're able to respond to a specific thing that you felt did not tell the whole story. So I think a letter to the editor is an option there. And I also think, it might even be something you're sharing about with family or friends, or even something that you're writing a whole op-ed for, maybe for a local paper, just because the New York Times is so competitive. And it might not even be specifically about that issue, but for example, what comes to mind for me right now is eggs, right? So eggs are so prevalent in the news right now, and it's a great opportunity for people who want to promote plant-based eating to say, hey, if you're having trouble affording eggs, why not consider some plant-based options and the different ethical and environmental benefits that might come from that. So that, that might be something that's more broadly on the public attention right now that you could write about. Anyway, I feel like you could go a lot of different ways with your energy, but those are just a couple initial thoughts.
Thank you. And it sounds like time is of the essence when it's a letter to the editor. It has to be pretty quick.
Especially with a letter to the editor, for sure, within a few days.
Okay.
If not the same day or the next day, ideally. With op-eds, you have a little more flexibility, but my kind of rule of thumb is that if there's an incident in the news, for instance, here in the Twin Cities, about 1.5 years ago, there was a semi that toppled over and dozens of pigs ended up wandering one of our major highways. And I didn't have a lot of time to write about it right away, but I did feel like it was in the news a lot, that all these pigs had been seen wandering the highway. It felt like a good opportunity to draw attention to farmed animal issues. And so my goal was within a few weeks, I'm going to get my piece into the editor. And that felt like kind of the max amount of time on an op-ed. If there's a specific news story, ideally I'd want something within 1 to 2 weeks being sent into an editor, but sometimes up to a month could be okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks for that question. And we have one from a former board member of UUAM, BJ, Rebecca Allen, if you want to unmute and state your question.
Thank you. My question is, when I look at the paper, my little local paper for 2000, there are a lot of things I would like to talk about. And so I started collecting I'm going to write about water. I'm going to write about animals. I'm going to write about this. And so I am wondering about how one narrows it down. And it sounds like it may be the currentness or my passion. And you've given me some ideas today about keeping a collection on the water situation, because we've had droughts here. But gosh, the eggs too. I mean, there's so much. How do you narrow it down? Because you are aware of a lot going on.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. And I think you're spot on with your response of it kind of being a combination of your passion and the timeliness. I think it's also a practice of maybe stepping back and thinking about what is going to be most appealing to read about or most attractive to read about to the general public. For example, when it comes to animal issues, I think if you get an animal related article in the news, you have arrived, because it is not high on the list of priorities for editors. So, even you mentioning water, I think animals, of course, that's my area of passion, but I think it may be an easier starting point, and it does relate to animal welfare too, of course, in many ways. But yeah, I think thinking about what's going to be most attractive to an average reader who's not involved in animal or environmental issues and what's affecting their lives, right? So maybe the drought, again, because it's having some degree of personal impact and visibility for anyone in the community, it might be an easier starting point to get people to care about environmental and animal issues.
Thank you. Who else has a question? Raise your hand physically or with the reaction button. Oh, John. All right. Our executive director, John, please go ahead.
Thank you. This was a wonderful presentation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And one of the ways I found it challenging to test some of my assumptions is that often when I am writing for animals or and certainly when I'm speaking for animals in Unitarian Universalist congregations, I often avoid the more emotional language. I'm looking back. Yeah, emotional was one of the 6 recommendations that you named earlier in the success acronym. And I think I do that in part because I think that emotional presentations in writing or in speech are going to turn off the reader or the viewer and make them discount me or what I'm saying. So I try to focus on the facts of the issue and in hopes that that I can write it in such a way that the reader will have their own emotional response without myself coming off as too emotional, although obviously I'm writing about it because I care about it. So I'm curious what you think of that strategy and whether yeah, it's something I'll just be pondering whether I should be bringing more emotion into the writing itself.
That's fascinating. It's really interesting to hear that approach. And I can see how, I definitely think it's important that people come to their own conclusions about things, but I also think people need a way to connect. And when you were mentioning this, what came to mind was actually that example I shared earlier of the dog caught in the fur trap, because I think if there's not an emotional element, I'm often missing out on an opportunity to grab someone's attention, and they may not even read through it because they get bored. They're kind of sifting through all this kind of like stats and kind of cold information. But if I can capture their attention with an emotional story, that might get them to commit to reading through the whole thing. And when I'm talking about, for example, a dog, many people love dogs, right? So I'm not telling you that you have to care about foxes and fur farms yet. I'm telling you to care about a dog, which you already care about. And maybe from there, you can extrapolate and make a connection to more animals. So I think what I'm trying to share with that is that I think if there's a way to tell an emotional story that feels accessible in some way, that is, instead of, for example, telling the story about a fox, telling the story about a dog was able to kind of maybe serve as an entry point for, yes, I already care about dogs, so can I connect to this issue? So yeah, I wonder if it would be interesting, to see what happens if you play around with more emotional storytelling. And I don't think you have to necessarily tell people what to think, but they could draw their own conclusions about the story, without you being too hard hitting. I think it's worth a try at least to see if that emotion does get more of a level of engagement than maybe a more impersonal sermon or story would.
If I can respond, I would just say I really appreciate your clarification, because I had been hearing the suggestion to incorporate emotion as meaning to come across yourself by sharing your own emotions about it. And it sounds like it's more about engaging the reader's emotion, which I definitely try to do and see the importance of. So thank you.
Oh yeah, that great clarification. Yeah, I think that's so crucial, because one of the things that, if any of you buy my ebook, you'll see there's a section about 7 tips for changing public opinion, which I think is so helpful. And one of them is using relatable spokespeople, basically. So if, for example, if you're wanting to promote more plant-based eating, have someone who eats animal products who says, I'm actually moving towards plant-based eating, and here's why. And it sort of creates this layer of trustworthiness where all of a sudden I'm less threatened. It's more accessible. I see someone like me, so I'm more inspired to try that or maybe explore that idea. So yeah, I think it's a great point that sometimes we don't necessarily want to share our personal emotion, although it can also be a useful tool in some settings. But even just stoking up emotion through a third person story can be very valuable.
Thank you for that question, John. That was important. So we have several questions now. So next up is Jackie Ziegler from Wauwatosa.
Greetings, and thank you very much, Julie, for a wonderful presentation. My question has to do with religion. Is there talk about how religion, using religious points of view, could be useful in the op-ed, or not useful, or whatever, something like that? Can you respond to that?
That's a fantastic question. Yeah. I think, this is all about considering your audience, right? I think, for example, John, in a sermon, maybe if you're writing something for your congregation, to be implementing religious values and themes would be super powerful. I think if you're writing for a general population, for the sake of accessibility, you may limit those religious themes because you wouldn't want the reader to think that it wasn't for them, right? So I think you just really have to be reflective of who you're trying to reach with your writing. And if it is writing to, say, a UU audience, then integrating a lot of UU themes is going to be incredibly valuable. And if it's not a UU audience, you may want to step back and broaden it out so that everyone feels like the piece is accessible and intended for them. But you may still implement some of the same values or personal stories that relate to your faith. But I think any kind of more detailed language might not be as accessible to a broad audience.
I was sort of thinking of like the golden rule. There's almost all religions have some kind of view of or statement that similar to the golden rule. I didn't know if there was anything similar in religious context that could work. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just say one more thing. That's a great point, is that I think there's a documentary, I'm sure some of you have seen it, called A Peaceable Kingdom. Maybe I'm not remembering the name quite right, but it's a documentary about how so many different religious practices and traditions have language or teachings related to care for creation and compassion for animals, and that can be a really unifying thread throughout different religious traditions. And so I think that might be a way to, like, something like the Golden Rule that's really shared throughout a lot of traditions and widespread in its acceptance throughout many faiths and belief systems. I think that might be a great place for creating some shared buy-in, some shared understanding in your writing, as long as it's something that is, shared throughout a number of different faith communities. I think that sounds great.
Thank you.
Next up is Helena. Am I pronouncing that correctly? You're up next.
Yeah, it's Helena, but that's okay. Basically, I've been trying to incorporate more of the senses into my writing, and I really don't have a problem with sound, sight, smell, and touch. But what do we do with taste? Can you give us some examples?
That's a great point. I think it'll depend on what you're writing about. I typically, if I'm just providing a description like the one I shared about the wildlife killing contest, I rarely hit like all 5 of the senses. It's just pretty uncommon that all of those would come into place in one scenario in a natural way. So I would say don't fret about leaving out taste. If there is a scenario that it makes sense in, maybe it's about the taste of a snowflake on your tongue in an environmental piece, or it's about the taste of a plant-based food. I think there are places where it could apply, but I think in most cases it's probably not going to be a core piece of the description. I hope that's helpful.
Thanks, that was great. Stephanie Jones.
Hi, everyone. This was wonderful. Thank you for putting it on. It's absolutely wonderful, Julie. Thank you. My question, I'm so happy because I actually, just 1 or 2 months ago, it was just the community paper, but at least it's 2,000 people. But I was able to get in, an article, pretty kind of long, about what to do if you find a sea turtle on the beach with cold stunning, if they hit the water when it's warm, because the water is so warm. So what I did, and I loved it, was that I did put a call in action. I put little, I bolded actually, what it is, what you could do, and things like that. But knowing the audience, I wanted so bad to get into why the water, that's okay, why cold stunning happens. It's because the turtles are, the water's warm, and then all of a sudden the water's cold. So they're staying up here. I'm in New York, they're staying up here longer. So I wanted to get into climate change. But the area that I'm in is doesn't believe in climate change. So I left that out, but how could you or would you add that pivotal piece of information to make the connection of why this is happening, if that makes sense? Like, I was basically saying, this happens, this is how it happens, and this is what you can do if you find a turtle. But I also wanted to kind of say why this is actually happening, that this is why we have to do this, if that makes sense. But I knew I would turn off every single, if not maybe 2 readers, if I started to go into climate change, because that's not the audience.
That's a very complicated situation. And I appreciate the question and the thought that you put into it. My instinct based on experience is that I want to focus as much as I can on a singular goal with each of my pieces. And so if I know that almost everyone will be turned off and probably stop reading and discredit what I'm saying if I mention this, I probably wouldn't mention it, but I might try to. Yeah, I do feel like, I haven't read your article, of course, but I do feel like you may have still hinted at it, even if you didn't explicitly mention it, you're explaining the scenario. And as people think through this and notice what's happening and kind of the nature behind the appearance of the turtles or the situation of the turtles, they're going to maybe connect some dots. I'd rather leave it for them to connect their, like to plant a seed kind of, rather than explicitly mentioning it and losing out on my main call to action, which people might then not be willing to take or would not put trust in. But it's up to you, because I do feel like there's value both ways. But I think if your main goal is the call to action around the sea turtles, I think focusing most energy there and trying to avoid any distractions is probably going to be the best bet. But I think there's pros and cons each way.
True. I will consider it a success because when I was walking the beach, when I was looking for them, there's quite a few fishermen that have certain bumper stickers. And one of them just yelled out, "Oh, hey, I ripped your thing out. I have the number on my refrigerator." So it's like, okay, sweet, cool. That's a little step
Oh,
from
that's
someone I
fantastic.
would not expect to have, read it.
That is so powerful. Like that is a
Yeah.
feather in your cap, and
I am
congratulations.
excited. Yeah.
That's
So don't let that
fantastic.
deter you. I wanted to tell others, don't let that deter you. And as you said, know your audience, right? And kind of, yeah. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and thank you for your advocacy. That's such an inspiring example. And, one thing that's always important to remember is that if you hear from one person, that is just the tip of the iceberg, right? You've probably impacted so many more who also have it on their fridge, but you'll just never hear from them. So I think even one piece of feedback is often indicative of like a much more sizable impact. So kudos to you.
Thank you so much. We also had a question from Robert, and you had one in the chat. I assume you're going to go over that same one you had in the chat that I was going to repeat, Robert. So I'll let you ask that one too.
That's correct. It's the same question. I just didn't know I was shotgunning you because I didn't know which would get to you. I was just thinking here, and this, by the way, I just agree with everybody else. This has been such a fabulously useful, wonderful, enlightening program. Thank you all for doing this. My question was just thinking about maybe the possibility as part of this, just the whole idea of developing a personal website, creating a personal website, and trying to grow that a bit, maybe as a gateway to greater accessibility to print or electronic sources to publish in, or just part of your overall portfolio. I know you could do a whole seminar on that, but I'm just curious how you all feel that fits in. Is that useful? I mean, I know some people have started with a blog or a personal website that then as they publish stuff, they took some of that and used that as material to get published itself.
Yeah, good question. I started my personal website because I kind of wanted a one-stop shop to house a lot of articles I had written about animal and environmental issues. However, I will say that because websites come with a cost and there also is the infrastructure and legwork of setting one up, many writers I know will just link a few stories in their, pitch emails to editors if they're sending articles out, just say, I had my work published in this paper with a link to the story there, and also in this paper with a link to the story there, just to show a couple examples. But it is nice to have a housing place. And it's always surprising to me, even though I know there's also a lot of bots on the internet, it's surprising how many people seem to find these sites independently. Just based on web traffic data, I can see how many people have been looking at different stories on my page, and it's always interesting. So I think it's a nice way to reach a different audience, especially as I mentioned, there's a little bit more about search engine optimization in my ebook. And if you want to implement some of those practices that basically, if you're unfamiliar with search engine optimization, there are some small and simple strategies you can implement that will increase the likelihood that when someone's searching something relevant to what you wrote, that you'll show up higher in Google searches or other search engines based on a few small key strategies like implementing subheadings with questions. So if you're interested in something like that, you can really drive a lot of traffic to a site through SEO strategies. And it can just be, a nice way that people can stumble upon your work, and you can have a little wider reach by using a website. But I think it depends on the amount of time and money you're willing to invest, because it is a little extra work. So depends on each person. Did I answer your question, or is there anything else I could add?
No, you answered it very well. And again, I so appreciate what you've done. Thank you.
Thanks for being here.